My name is Jaden Coleman, and in 2017, I took my RV up to the remote corners of Kluin National Park in the Yukon Territory. I figured that after years of crunching numbers as an accountant, a little adventure might do me some good. Always the guy behind the desk, I wanted to be the guy behind the wheel for once. The drive was long but breathtaking. Towering mountains draped in glaciers loomed over dense forests, and the air was so crisp it felt like a tonic. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near a pristine lake, the kind of place you'd see on a postcard. It was just me, the wilderness, and a stack of mystery novels I've been meaning to read. On the second day, I met a fellow camper named Hank, a grizzled old timer with a beard that could house a family of birds. He was full of stories about the area. "You picked a heck of a spot, Dorian," he said. "Not many folks come out this far. Keeps the riffraff out? Well, except for us accountants seeking thrills," I quipped. He chuckled. "Just keep an eye out for the wildlife. Bears around here have a sweet tooth for city folk." We shared a laugh, and he offered me some freshly caught trout before heading back to his campsite. That night, I cooked the fish over a campfire, feeling more content than I had in years. The stars overhead were so bright, they seemed to poke holes in the sky. The following morning, I decided to hike a nearby trail Hank had mentioned. It was supposedly an old trading route used by First Nations people, rarely trodden these days. Armed with a map, a compass, and my questionable sense of direction, I set off. About an hour into the hike, I stumbled upon something unusual, a series of wooden carvings hanging from the trees. They were intricate, depicting various animals and symbols I didn't recognize. One looked like a wolf intertwined with vines. Another was a raven with outstretched wings. "Local art installation?" I mused aloud. "Banky, eat your heart out." As I ventured deeper, the carvings became more frequent and more unsettling. One showed a human figure with antlers surrounded by flames. Another depicted a face with hollow eyes and an open mouth, as if screaming. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the northern air. Deciding it was best to head back, I turned around, only to hear a rustling in the bushes behind me. Probably just a squirrel on steroids, I told myself, picking up the pace. The rustling grew louder, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. The forest seemed denser than before, the trees pressing in like silent onlookers. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out. No response, just the wind whispering through the branches. I continued walking, my casual stroll now a hurried stride. Then I saw it, a figure darting between the trees. Too large for an animal, too swift for a casual hiker. "Okay, Dorian, time to break that personal best in the 100-meter dash," I muttered. I broke into a jog, then a run. The footsteps behind me quickened. My heart pounded in my chest like a frantic drum solo. In my haste, I tripped over an exposed root and went sprawling onto the ground. "Great takedown by a tree's toe," I groaned as I scrambled to my feet. A man emerged from the trees. He was tall and gaunt, wearing tattered clothes stained with dirt. And was that blood? His hair was wild, a tangled mane that framed a face etched with grime and something else, malice. "Lost?" he asked, a crooked grin spreading across his face. "Just heading back to my campsite," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Beautiful day for a hike, isn't it?" He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be here." "Funny, I was just thinking the same thing," I said, attempting a disarming smile. He took a step closer. I noticed he was holding something, a hunting knife, its blade glinting ominously. "Folks around here don't take kindly to trespassers," he said. "Trespassing? I thought this was a national park," I replied, inching backward. "Belongs to those who respect the land," he hissed. I decided then that conversation was overrated. Spinning on my heel, I bolted down the path. Adrenaline surged through me, and for a moment I felt like an Olympic sprinter, minus the cheering crowd and the gold medal. Behind me, I heard him give chase. His footsteps were heavy, but he was fast, too fast. The trail forked, and without thinking, I veered left. Bad choice. The path led to a steep incline strewn with rocks. I scrambled upward, my legs burning with effort. "Can't run forever," he shouted. "Watch me," I yelled back, though I doubted the wisdom of taunting a knife-wielding maniac. Reaching the top, I spotted a dilapidated cabin nestled among the trees. Smoke curled lazily from a makeshift chimney. Maybe someone inside can help, I thought. I sprinted toward the cabin and banged on the door. "Hello? Is anyone home? I need help." No answer. The door was ajar, and without hesitation, I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was a shrine of horrors. Animal skulls adorned the walls, and the stench of decay was overpowering. On a wooden table lay various tools, some rusty, others ominously clean. "Well, this isn't the cozy cottage I was hoping for," I whispered. A quick survey of the room revealed no weapons, but I grabbed a hefty-looking fireplace poker. Footsteps approached the doorway. Come out, wherever you are," the man sang mockingly. I pressed myself against the wall beside the door, holding my breath as he stepped inside. I swung the poker with all my might. It connected with his forearm, causing him to drop the knife. He let out a guttural yell. No, can't use that word. A deep, rage-filled shout. Before he could recover, I darted past him, knocking over a shelf of jars filled with unidentifiable contents. "You're only making it worse for yourself," he roared. I didn't stick around for further discussion. Racing back down the trail, I aimed for a different route, hoping to throw him off. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. "Next time, Dorian, maybe stick to beaches and pina coladas," I chided myself as I ran. I stumbled upon a grisly sight, a shallow grave with a partially buried body. The exposed hand was pale and lifeless. Nearby, a backpack lay ripped open, its contents strewn about, a map, a water bottle, and a journal. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to keep moving. The reality of the danger was now stark and undeniable. The trees thinned, and I burst into a clearing where Hank's campsite was supposed to be. But instead of his modest tent, there was chaos. The tent was slashed to ribbons and blood stained the ground. "No, not Hank," I whispered. A noise behind me made me spin around. The man was there, his eyes wild, a second knife in his hand. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted. He grinned. "The land demands sacrifice." "Look, if it's about the trout, I can catch you another one," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. He lunged at me. "Wait, can't use that word." He charged forward, swinging the blade. I dodged, but not fast enough. A searing pain shot through my arm as the knife grazed me. In a panic, I grabbed a metal camping chair and hurled it at him. It struck his shoulder, causing him to stumble. Seizing the moment, I sprinted toward my RV, which was mercifully visible through the trees. My keys were in my pocket, and I fumbled to retrieve them. Reaching the RV, I yanked the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut just as he reached me. He pounded on the door and window, his face a mask of fury. "There's nowhere to go," he screamed. "Funny, this thing's got wheels," I muttered, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered to life. I threw it into gear and hit the gas. The RV lurched forward, knocking him aside. In the rearview mirror, I saw him pick himself up, a look of sheer hatred etched on his face. The road was rough, but I didn't care. Branches scraped against the sides of the RV as I barreled down the unpaved path. My hands shook, blood from the cut on my arm staining the steering wheel. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the main road. I drove straight to the nearest town, a small community called Haines Junction. Bursting into the local police station, I recounted everything in a rush, a torrent of words. An officer named Sergeant Billings listened attentively. "We've had reports of missing hikers in that area," he said gravely. "Sounds like you had a close call." They dispatched a team to investigate. Hours later, they found the cabin, but reported that it had been set ablaze, reduced to smoldering ruins. No sign of the man or the bodies. "He's covering his tracks," Sergeant Billings said, "but we'll find him." Days later, I learned that the man was believed to be Elias Crowther, a former wildlife guide who went off the grid years ago. Rumor had it he became obsessed with ancient rituals, believing that sacrifices were needed to protect the land from outsiders. In the final sentence of the report I read, it stated, Elias Crowther remains at large, driven by delusions that demand offerings to the wilderness he worships. I left the Yukon the next day, the open road ahead, and a newfound appreciation for the predictable dangers of city life. My name is Grayson Arnold, and back in 2020, I took my RV up to Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska. I figured a solo trip into the wild would be the perfect antidote to my cubicle-induced claustrophobia. Plus, after burning yet another batch of spaghetti at home, I thought maybe, just maybe, the wilderness would help me find my inner Bear Grylls, or at least teach me how not to set off the smoke alarm. I arrived at the park on a crisp August morning. The air was so fresh, it felt like nature's version of a deep breath. I parked my RV in a secluded spot near a glacial stream, thinking I'd found my own little slice of paradise. The only neighbors I had were towering pines and the occasional moose, who looked at me like I was the intruder, which, to be fair, I was. After setting up camp, I decided to explore the surroundings, armed with a map, a compass I pretended to know how to use, and a trail mix that was 90% chocolate. I ventured into the forest. The serenity was overwhelming. For once, the only notifications I heard were birds chirping and leaves rustling. It was a far cry from the constant ping of emails back home. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon a small weathered cabin nestled between the trees. It looked abandoned, with ivy crawling up the sides and windows clouded by dust. Curiosity got the better of me. I thought, why not take a peek? After all, what's the worst that could happen? Famous last words, I know. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a single-room interior cluttered with old furniture and hunting gear. Animal traps, fishing rods, and a wall adorned with antlers suggested that whoever lived here was serious about off-the-grid living or just had a very specific decorating style. On a dusty table lay a journal. The pages were filled with scribbled notes and sketches of the surrounding area. One entry caught my eye. August 12th, spotted another hiker today. Must be cautious. Can't let anyone find out. That was yesterday's date. A chill settled in my gut. Maybe the cabin wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. I decided it was best to head back to my RV. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, and I didn't want to navigate the forest in the dark. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Every snap of a twig and rustling leaf set my nerves on edge. I told myself I was being paranoid, perhaps a side effect of too many late-night horror movies and bad campfire stories. Back at the campsite, I cooked dinner over the fire, a culinary masterpiece of canned beans and slightly burnt sausages. I mused that Gordon Ramsay would have a field day critiquing my cooking skills. It's so raw it might just get up and walk away. I imagined him shouting. I chuckled into the night, the sound echoing among the trees. To lighten the mood further, I started telling jokes to myself. Why don't scientists trust atoms? Because they make up everything. I laughed, appreciating my own terrible sense of humor. It was just me in the wilderness, and I was determined to enjoy every minute. Just as I was considering turning in for the night, I heard a noise, a faint rustling coming from the edge of the clearing. Probably just an animal, I thought. Alaska is full of wildlife. Then I heard it again, louder this time, accompanied by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. Human footsteps. Who's there? I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Silence. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the tree line. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow dart between the trees. My heart began to race. Maybe it was another camper, or perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me. Deciding that sitting outside made me feel too exposed, I retreated into the RV and locked the door. I felt a bit silly for being spooked, but better safe than sorry. I settled into bed, convincing myself that a good night's sleep would put everything into perspective. I woke abruptly to a loud thud against the side of the RV. My pulse quickened. That was no falling branch. I listened intently, straining to hear any other sounds. Then came another thud, harder this time, causing the RV to sway slightly. I quietly got out of bed and reached for the small kitchen knife I'd used earlier. Not exactly a weapon of choice, but it was better than nothing. I crept toward the window and peeked out, but the darkness revealed nothing. Suddenly, the RV's door handle jiggled. Someone was trying to get in. Panic surged through me. "Hey, who's out there?" I shouted, hoping to deter whoever it was. The jiggling stopped momentarily, only to resume more aggressively. I had to think fast. My phone had no signal, so calling for help was out of the question. Then I remembered the flare gun stowed away in a cabinet, a safety precaution I never thought I'd need. I grabbed it and positioned myself facing the door. "Leave now or I'll shoot," I warned. The handle stopped moving. Silence enveloped the RV. Just when I thought it might be over, a heavy object slammed against the door, cracking the frame. I fired the flare gun at the door, the bright light illuminating the interior in a flash of red. The impact startled the intruder, and I heard footsteps retreating into the woods. Breathing heavily, I waited for any sign of return. Minutes passed like hours. When everything remained quiet, I dared to hope that it was over. Sleep was out of the question, so I sat vigil until dawn, clutching the kitchen knife with a white-knuckled grip. As the first light seeped through the windows, I decided to step outside and assess the damage. The door was splintered, hanging ajar from its hinges. On the ground lay a heavy piece of timber, likely used to batter the door. But what caught my attention was a symbol carved into the wood, a crude drawing of an eye with a slash through it. I snapped a photo with my phone, thinking it might be useful evidence. Just then, I heard voices in the distance, multiple people talking and laughing. Relief washed over me. Other campers, perhaps. I headed toward the sound, hoping to find help. As I approached, I realized the voices were coming from a small group gathered around a makeshift campsite. They were an odd bunch, dressed in ragged clothes, their faces smudged with dirt. They fell silent as soon as they noticed me. "Morning," I said cautiously. "Did you folks happen to see anyone around here last night?" One of them, a tall man with a tangled beard, stepped forward. "No one but us out here," he replied, his gaze steady and unblinking. I noticed something unsettling. The same eye symbol from the timber was tattooed on his forearm. A knot tightened in my stomach. "Interesting tattoo," I remarked, trying to keep my tone light. "It's more than a tattoo," he said. "Right. Well, if you see anyone suspicious, let me know. Someone tried to break into my RV last night." He gave a faint smile. "The forest doesn't take kindly to trespassers." I decided it was time to leave. "All right then, have a good day." I turned to walk away, feeling their eyes on my back like a physical weight. As I hurried back to my RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something dangerous. I resolved to pack up and get out of there as fast as possible. When I returned, I found my RV ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, belongings scattered, and the words "Leave now" were scrawled across the wall in what looked like charcoal. My heart pounded in my chest. This was no longer just a creepy encounter. It was a direct threat. I gathered what I could and started the engine. As I drove down the dirt road leading out of the park, I caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. The group from earlier, standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. Just when I thought I was safe, a loud bang echoed from the side of the RV. The vehicle lurched, and I struggled to keep it on the road. I looked out the window to see one of my tires blown out. I cursed under my breath. I pulled over to assess the damage. The tire was shredded, and upon closer inspection, I found a makeshift spike strip embedded with nails lying nearby. This was deliberate. Out of nowhere, a figure tackled me, knocking me to the ground. It was the bearded man from the campsite. He held a knife, his eyes wild with intent. We grappled, adrenaline fueling my movements. He slashed at me, grazing my arm. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, dodging another attack. "Outsiders aren't welcome here," he snarled. I kicked at his knee, causing him to stumble. Seizing the opportunity, I scrambled back toward the RV. Another member of the group appeared, blocking my path. She swung a metal pipe at me. I ducked, and it smashed into the RV's side mirror. Desperate, I remembered the flare gun still tucked into my belt. I pulled it out and aimed it at them. "Back off!" I shouted. They hesitated, eyeing the weapon. The woman sneered. "That toy won't save you," she advanced. Without thinking, I fired. The flare struck her shoulder, igniting her clothes. She screamed, dropping to the ground to extinguish the flames. The bearded man charged at me in a rage. I sidestepped, causing him to crash into the side of the RV. The impact dazed him. I took the chance to climb into the driver's seat and slam the door shut. I started the engine. Despite the flat tire, the RV lurched forward, grinding against the road. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. As I sped down the rough path, the vehicle shook violently. The other tires threatened to give out, but I pushed on. In the distance, I saw a ranger station. Relief flooded over me. I pulled up, haphazardly honking the horn wildly. A park ranger emerged, alarmed by the sight of my battered RV and my disheveled state. "Please, I need help," I shouted. He approached cautiously. "Calm down, sir. What's going on?" "A group of people attacked me. They're back there, sabotaging the road and attacking campers." His expression grew serious. "Did you say a group?" "Yes, they tried to break into my RV last night and attacked me on the road." He radioed for backup. "You're lucky you made it here. We've had reports of a cult operating in the remote areas of the park." "A cult?" "They're hostile to outsiders. We've been trying to track them down." Another ranger arrived. They escorted me inside and tended to my wounds. I gave a full account of what happened, showing them the photo of the symbol and describing the attackers. Over the next few hours, law enforcement combed the area. They found the spike strip and evidence of the group's campsite, but the cult members had disappeared. I was advised to stay in town until they could ensure the area was safe. They arranged for my RV to be repaired, and I checked into a local motel. At the motel, the receptionist looked up as I approached the desk. "Rough day?" she asked, eyeing my torn sleeve and bandaged arm. "You could say that," I replied. "I've had better Mondays. At least you didn't have to sit through a budget meeting." She chuckled. "Well, we've got cable and hot water. Sometimes that's all you need. Throw in a decent cup of coffee, and you might just convince me to stay forever." The following day, news came in. The authorities had discovered several shallow graves near where my RV had been parked. The bodies of missing hikers were recovered, victims of the cult's gruesome acts. I realized how close I'd come to becoming one of them. As for the cult, they remained at large. Their leader, identified as Marcus Hale, was a former survivalist with a history of violent offenses. He had gathered a group of like-minded individuals, preying on unsuspecting campers and hikers. I decided it was time to head home. The allure of the wilderness had lost its charm. Before leaving, I thanked the rangers for their help and provided any additional information they needed. I drove out of Alaska, the road stretching ahead like a promise of safety. As I left, I couldn't help but think about Marcus Hale, a man who had turned his back on society, using isolation and violence over humanity. I drove on, the open road ahead, leaving the shadows of the forest and its secrets behind. My name is Nora Harris, and I'm 42 years old. I'm a teacher, or at least I was before the divorce turned my life upside down a few months ago. I decided to take some time off, pack up my RV, and just drive. I thought solitude might help me figure things out, what I wanted, who I was outside the wreckage of my marriage. That's how I ended up at Dogtown, an abandoned colonial settlement in Gloucester, Massachusetts. I'd heard about the place in passing, legends of witches, curses, and cryptic carvings. It sounded like the kind of eerie, offbeat spot that might spark some inspiration for the memoir I'd been toying with. A quiet weekend in the woods surrounded by history seemed perfect. I didn't know then that Dogtown was the last place I should have been. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, parking my RV just off an old dirt road at the edge of the woods. The air was crisp, the sky tinged with the warm hues of early autumn. I set up a small fire and sat outside with my journal, jotting down random thoughts as the sun dipped below the horizon. The silence was strange, not the peaceful kind, but heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves, but even that felt deliberate. I shrugged it off, convincing myself I was just overthinking. That night, the RV heater stopped working. I bundled up in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the flickering lantern casting jittery shadows across the walls. Sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I heard something or someone whispering outside. It was faint, like the wind carrying voices too soft to make out. My heart pounded, but when I peeked through the window, the clearing was empty. The next morning, I drove into Gloucester for coffee and a bit of human interaction. I ended up at a small diner near the harbor, the kind of place where locals outnumber tourists. That's where I met Edgar. He was sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee and chatting with the waitress. When I mentioned I was camping near Dogtown, his demeanor changed. He turned to me, his weathered face suddenly serious. "You camping out there alone?" he asked. I nodded. "Just me." Edgar frowned. "Dogtown's cursed. Always has been. Witches, they say. Bad things happen to people who don't belong." I chuckled nervously, but he didn't join in. "You're serious?" I asked. "They don't like trespassers," he said, his voice low. "You hear whispers yet? See anyone out there?" My stomach flipped. I thought I heard something last night, probably just the wind. "It's never just the wind," he said. "Mark my words, if you see her—" "See who?" I asked. He didn't answer, just shook his head and returned to his coffee. That afternoon, I decided to explore the ruins of Dogtown. The trails were overgrown, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. The famous words were scattered throughout the area, each inscribed with cryptic phrases like courage and resist. They were supposed to be motivational, but out here they felt more like warnings. Then I found a boulder unlike the others. Its surface was etched with strange runes, jagged symbols I didn't recognize. I pulled out my phone to snap a picture, but the screen went black. The battery was dead, even though I charged it that morning. As I stared at the carvings, I felt it, a presence. When I turned, I saw her. A woman standing at the edge of the trees, her figure draped in tattered colonial clothing. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and she was watching me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out. She didn't move. For a moment, I thought she might be a reenactor or local messing with me, but then she turned and disappeared into the woods without a sound. That night, back at the RV, I couldn't shake the image of the woman. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But as darkness fell, the unease grew. The whispers started again, louder this time. They seemed to echo my own thoughts, repeating fragments of my journal entries. "Why did you stay so long? Why did you give so much?" I bolted upright, my pulse racing. Then I heard it, the sound of scratching against the RV's door. Slowly, I grabbed the lantern and crept toward the noise. When I opened the door, no one was there. But etched into the paint was a symbol, a spiral surrounding a handprint. The next morning, I decided to leave. Whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. The RV wouldn't start. I spent the afternoon hiking deeper into the woods, hoping to find better cell service or at least some answers. That's when I stumbled upon the ruins of an old cabin. Inside, the air was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in more of those strange symbols. On a rotting table, I found a book. Its pages were brittle, filled with cryptic notes and eerie drawings. One illustration stopped me cold. It showed a woman being hanged, her face twisted in agony. She looked exactly like the figure I'd seen in the woods. As I flipped through the book, a shadow passed over the doorway. I spun around, but no one was there. Edgar called me that evening. Somehow, he'd found my number through the diner's guest book. His voice was frantic. "Nora, you have to leave now." "I'm trying," I said. "The RV won't start." "Then walk," he said. "You don't understand. Tammy Younger cursed that land. She's still there and she's angry. She wants what was taken from her." "Who's Tammy Younger?" I asked. "The last witch of Dogtown," he said. "They hanged her for things she didn't do, and she cursed the town with her dying breath. Anyone who trespasses pays the price." That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. The RV shook, as if something was clawing at its sides. Desperate, I grabbed the book and followed the sound into the woods, as if drawn by an invisible force. The trail led me to a stone circle surrounded by dead trees. The woman, Tammy, stood at its center, her figure glowing faintly in the darkness. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice like wind through the trees. "You are all the same, stealing, taking, leaving nothing behind." "I didn't mean to disturb you," I said, my voice trembling. "I'll leave, I promise." She raised a hand and the ground trembled. Spectral hands emerged from the soil, clawing toward me. I fell to my knees, clutching the book. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "What do you want?" Tammy's eyes burned with malice. "An offering," she said. "Something of value." I had nothing to give. No trinkets, no valuables. In desperation, I tore a page from my journal, one where I'd poured out my deepest regrets about the divorce, my failures, my pain. I held it out, letting the wind carry it into the circle. Tammy hesitated, her expression softening. The hands retreated and the ground stilled. For a moment, I thought I saw something human in her eyes. Sorrow, perhaps. Then she faded into the darkness, leaving me alone in the hollow. When I returned to the RV, it started without issue. I drove away as fast as I could, the woods swallowing the clearing behind me. Months later, I published my memoir. It was raw, honest, and deeply personal. The book became a success, though I never mentioned Dogtown in its pages. But even now, late at night, I sometimes hear whispers outside my window, and I wonder if Tammy Younger is still watching, waiting for the price I haven't yet paid. My name is Hannah Miller, and I was 29 when this happened. It was the summer of 2022, and I was in Greenbrier Valley, West Virginia, filming a documentary on Appalachian folklore. I thought I knew what I was getting into. A little spooky local history, some beautiful landscapes, and maybe a few nervous laughs from my friends. I was wrong, dead wrong. It all started with Elliot, my best friend since college. Elliot's a big guy with a soft heart and an even softer spot for ghost stories. He's the one who got me into the supernatural in the first place, which is how we ended up planning this trip to the abandoned Greenbrier ghost tracks. He called it the perfect setting for my project. Elliot's girlfriend, Marcy, wasn't so enthusiastic. She's sarcastic to the bone and has a knack for poking holes in everyone's plans. "Haunted train tracks, really?" She scoffed when we pitched it. "What's next? A seance in the Walmart parking lot?" Still, she came along, probably because she didn't trust us to survive a weekend in the woods without her. Dan and Ruby rounded out the group. Dan's the life of the party, always cracking jokes and pushing boundaries, while Ruby, well, Ruby's quiet, but she notices everything. I've known her for years, and she's got this sixth sense about people and places. It was Ruby who first warned us that something felt off, We got to the tracks late that afternoon. The forest was thick and green, the air heavy with humidity. The tracks were almost invisible beneath layers of moss and tangled weeds. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd miss them entirely. But the locals hadn't forgotten. They called them the ghost tracks because of the Iron Witch, a spirit said to haunt the area. Legend had it she'd been accused of witchcraft and hanged near the tracks in the 1800s. Before she died, she cursed the town, vowing to haunt anyone who trespassed on her land. The legend didn't scare me, it fascinated me. We're filming history, I said, adjusting my camera as we set up camp. The clearing wasn't ideal. Dan's tent had a broken pole, and Marcy realized she'd forgotten extra flashlight batteries, but it would do. By the time we got a fire going, the sun was dipping below the trees, painting the sky a deep orange. The first sign of trouble came after dinner. We were sitting around the fire, laughing at one of Dan's ridiculous impressions, when the forest went silent. Not gradually, like you'd expect when animals settle in for the night, but all at once, like someone had hit a switch. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. Ruby was the first to speak. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" Dan said, grinning. "The sweet, sweet vibe of nature?" Ruby didn't laugh. "Something's wrong," she said. "We're not supposed to be here." Marcy rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. It's just the woods at night. Stop trying to scare us." But I felt it too, that heavy, oppressive stillness. I tried to brush it off as nerves. I mean, I was the one who dragged us all out here, right? If anyone needed to stay rational, it was me. The second sign came a little after midnight. We were settling into our tents when we heard it. A low, rhythmic hum, faint but distinct, like the sound of an old train engine in the distance. Dan poked his head out of his tent, grinning. "Is that your ghost train?" "Just probably the wind," I said, though my voice sounded thin even to me. "Yeah, right. Wind doesn't go chugga chugga choo choo," Marcy muttered. Ruby sat bolt upright, clutching her sleeping bag. "It's not wind," she whispered. "It's her." I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to that sound. It got louder and louder, like the train was barreling straight toward us, and then it stopped. Not faded, stopped. I scrambled out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and found the others already outside. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the clearing. "What the hell was that?" Elliot asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, "but we should stay together." Ruby was the first to notice the scratches on the trees. They were deep, jagged marks, like something or someone had taken a blade to the bark. The scratches formed strange symbols, almost like runes. I filmed them, though my hands were trembling so badly the footage probably came out useless. "This is messed up," Marcy said, backing away. "We need to leave now." Dan laughed nervously. "What? And miss the big ghost reveal? Come on, Marcy, it's just some local pranksters messing with us." But Ruby shook her head. "No one's been here in years," she said. "This isn't a prank." The third sign came when Marcy disappeared. She'd stormed off after another argument with Elliot, saying she needed some space. We waited, calling her name, but she didn't come back. Finally, Elliot and I grabbed our flashlights and went looking for her, leaving Ruby and Dan by the fire. We found her an hour later, stumbling out of the trees, her arms scratched and bleeding, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Marcy, what happened?" I asked, rushing to her side. She looked at me, trembling. "I heard you," she said, "calling me, but it wasn't you. It wasn't you." Back at camp, things went from bad to worse. Dan tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes about camping with Casper, but even he couldn't hide how scared he was. Ruby sat by the fire, staring into the flames, muttering something under her breath. "What's she doing?" I whispered to Elliot. "Praying," I think he said. Her grandmother told her about this place. Yo said it was cursed. The attack came just before dawn. We were packing up, ready to leave, when the forest exploded with noise. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, something heavy crashing through the underbrush. And then it hit Dan. I don't know how to describe it. One moment he was standing there cracking a joke. The next, he was flying backward, slamming into a tree with a sickening crack. He screamed, clutching his leg, which was bent at an unnatural angle. Get him up, I yelled. But the thing, whatever it was, wasn't done. It circled us, its shadow flickering in the firelight. I caught glimpses of it. Long limbs, pale skin stretched tight over bones, and a face. God, that face. It wasn't human. Ruby saved us. She grabbed a knife from her bag, slicing her palm and letting her blood drip onto the ground. She chanted something in a language I didn't understand, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. The thing stopped, its head tilting like it was listening. Then it vanished. We carried Dan out of the woods, Marcy supporting one side of him, Elliot and I taking the other. Ruby led the way, her bloody hand pressed to her chest. We didn't stop until we reached the road. Days later, I reviewed the footage. Most of it was unusable. Shaky shots, too dark to see anything. But there was one clip that made my blood run cold. It showed me standing by the fire, filming the group, and behind me, in the shadows, was the figure. It was watching us. I haven't been back to Greenbrier since. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that hum again, the sound of a train that doesn't exist, and I wonder if the Iron Witch is still out there, waiting for her next trespassers. My name is Nolan Graves, and in 2017 I took my RV out to the remote stretches of the Yukon Territory in Canada. Being cooped up in an office for years had me yearning for some real adventure and fresh air. I figured a solo trip into the wilderness would be just the ticket to reset my mind. I had always been an outdoor enthusiast, but life's responsibilities kept pushing my plans further down the line. Finally, I decided enough was enough. I packed up my gear, loaded the RV, and set off for Kluane National Park. The idea of vast landscapes and untouched nature was too alluring to resist. The drive was uneventful, filled with the usual mix of truckers and fellow travelers. I made a stop in a small town called Haines Junction to stock up on supplies. The locals were friendly but gave me that look. You know, the one that says, "You're not from around here, are you?" One old timer at the general store chuckled when I told him where I was headed. "Watch out for the gold," he said with a grin. "Gold?" I replied, raising an eyebrow. "Folks around here get crazy when it comes to gold," he added before shuffling away. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just local humor that went over my city slicker head. With my RV loaded, I continued toward the park. The scenery became more breathtaking with each mile, the kind of beauty that makes you forget about emails and deadlines. I found a secluded spot near a crystal clear lake surrounded by towering mountains. Setting up camp, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I spent the day hiking and snapping photos, marveling at how untouched everything felt. That evening, I built a small fire and settled in with a book. The silence was profound, only broken by the occasional rustling of leaves or distant animal calls. As night fell, the temperature dropped significantly. I retreated into the RV, thankful for the small heater I had installed. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a faint noise outside, like metal clinking. Probably just settling sounds, I told myself. But then it happened again, louder this time. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me instantly, and I could see my breath forming small clouds. Scanning the area, I saw nothing unusual. The RV stood alone under the starlit sky, and the forest edge was shrouded in darkness. "Must be hearing things," I muttered, turning to go back inside. That's when I noticed footprints near the back of the RV, fresh ones that weren't mine. They led toward the woods and disappeared among the trees. A chill ran down my spine, and not just from the cold. I decided it was best to lock up and stay inside for the night. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the windows, and the uneasy feeling from the night before seemed almost silly. I convinced myself it was probably a hunter or another camper passing by. After breakfast, I decided to explore a nearby trail that promised stunning views. About an hour into the hike, I stumbled upon something that made me stop in my tracks: a rusty pickaxe leaning against a tree with a worn leather bag beside it. Curiosity piqued. I approached and nudged the bag with my foot. Out spilled a collection of old mining tools in a small glass vial filled with gold flakes. "Well, would you look at that?" I said aloud. Maybe the old timer wasn't joking after all. I considered taking the vial, but thought better of it. Last thing I needed was to get involved in someone else's business. As I continued along the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, but whenever I turned around, nothing was there. Deciding I'd had enough hiking for one day, I headed back to camp. As I approached, I noticed smoke rising in the distance, not from my sight, but somewhere nearby. It seemed odd, given how isolated this place was. Behind the RV, I made a sandwich and tried to relax, but an uneasiness settled in. To distract myself, I pulled out my fishing gear and walked down to the lake. The water was so clear you could see the fish swimming near the surface. I cast my line and waited. "Not biting today, huh?" I said after an hour with no luck. Just then, a voice behind me replied, "Fish around here don't care much for strangers." I nearly jumped out of my skin, spinning around. I saw a man standing a few feet away. He was rugged looking, with a thick beard and clothes that had seen better days. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said with a crooked smile. "No worries," I replied, trying to steady my voice. "Didn't hear you coming." "I'm used to moving quietly," he said, stepping closer. "Name's Silas." "Nolan," I offered, extending a hand. He looked at it for a moment before shaking it. "Firm grip." "What brings you out to these parts?" he asked. "Just taking some time off work, enjoying nature," I said. He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning me up and down. "Not many folks come out here alone." "I like the solitude," I replied, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "Solitude's a funny thing," he mused. "Can make a man see and do strange things." "Well, I should probably get back," I said, reeling in my line. "Sure thing. Be seeing you around," he said, that crooked smile returning. I hurried back to the RV, glancing over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't following me. Something about Silas didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way he appeared out of nowhere, or how he seemed to savor each word he spoke. That evening, I decided to keep a low profile. I locked all the doors and windows, drew the shades, and kept the lights dimmed. As the hours passed, I started to feel a bit silly. Maybe I was overreacting. Around midnight, just as I was about to call it a night, I heard footsteps circling the RV. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for the closest thing resembling a weapon, a cast iron skillet. The footsteps stopped near the door. There was a scratching sound, followed by a low chuckle. My palms were sweaty as I gripped the skillet tighter. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. Then a whispered reply, "Just enjoying the night air." It was Silas. "What do you want?" I demanded. "Thought you might like some company," he said. "I'm fine on my own, thanks." "Funny thing about being alone," he continued. "You never know what's lurking around." "Leave me alone," I shouted. The doorknob rattled as he tried to open it. "Now that's not very hospitable," he said. I backed away, my mind racing. The keys were in the ignition. I could start the RV and get out of here, but what if he tried to block me? I had to think fast. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the roof, followed by the sound of footsteps overhead. My eyes darted upward. How many of them were there? Desperate, I dashed to the driver's seat, tossing the skillet aside. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Without wasting a second, I slammed it into gear and hit the gas. The RV lurched forward, knocking whoever was on the roof off balance. In the rearview mirror, I saw Silas stumbling to his feet, a look of rage contorting his face. The narrow dirt road was treacherous in the dark, but adrenaline fueled my focus. Branches scraped against the sides as I sped down the path. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the main road, breathing a sigh of relief. I slowed down, but then headlights appeared in the distance behind me. Two motorcycles, gaining fast. Panic surged. Seriously? What is this, a horror movie? I muttered, trying to inject some humor into a dire situation. I floored the accelerator, but the RV wasn't built for speed. The motorcycles closed the gap quickly. One pulled up alongside me, and I caught a glimpse of the rider, another rugged-looking man, his face partially covered by a bandana. He swung something heavy against the side window, a metal chain. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. "Not today," I shouted, swerving the RV toward him. He veered off, losing control and skidding into the brush. The second rider was more persistent. He pulled ahead and tried to block the road. I had no choice. Clenching my jaw, I gripped the wheel and rammed the RV into his bike. He tumbled away as I sped past. Heart pounding, I kept driving until the sun began to rise. I reached a larger town and pulled into a gas station, shaking from the ordeal. I stumbled inside and told the clerk to call the police. Within minutes, officers arrived. I recounted everything: the encounters with Silas, the attack, the chase. They exchanged glances. "You're not the first to report something like this," one officer said grimly. "Excuse me?" "There's a group operating in these parts," he continued. "Illegal miners protecting their claims. They've been known to intimidate or worse." "Illegal miners? Like gold miners?" I asked, recalling the old-timer's warning. "Exactly. They don't take kindly to outsiders stumbling upon their operations," he said. They took my statement and assured me they'd investigate. Exhausted, I decided to find a motel and get some rest. Later that day, curiosity got the better of me. Using my laptop, I dug into local news and forums. Stories surfaced about missing hikers, unexplained disappearances, and rumors of a shadowy group guarding hidden mines. One article mentioned a man named Silas Harper, a former geologist turned illegal miner, suspected in multiple disappearances but never charged due to lack of evidence. Great. I had a run-in with a psycho prospector, I muttered. I informed the police about what I found, hoping it would help their investigation. A few days later, I prepared to head home. As I was fueling up, I overheard two men talking. "Another camper went missing up near Clane," one said. "Must have crossed paths with Silas and his crew," the other replied. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't over for others out there. Driving away, I couldn't shake the thought of those still venturing into the wilderness, unaware of the dangers lurking, not from nature, but from those guarding their secrets with deadly resolve. Silas Harper, a man driven by greed, willing to do anything to protect his hidden gold mines, no matter the cost. My name is Grayson Allen, and back in 2018, I took my RV to the dense forests of Olympic National Park in Washington State. After 10 years of juggling numbers as an accountant, I figured it was time to exchange spreadsheets for pine trees. Maybe I'd find out if bears really do prefer picnic baskets. The open road was a welcome change from the monotony of office life. As I drove, the skyscrapers faded into towering evergreens, and the air grew crisp and fresh. I wondered if this was what air was supposed to smell like without the usual hint of exhaust fumes. By late afternoon, I found the perfect spot to set up camp, a secluded clearing near Lake Crescent. The water shimmered under the fading sunlight, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. Not bad for a city slicker, I thought, patting myself on the back. I spent the next hour setting up, unfolded my chair, fired up the portable grill, and even attempted to fish off the lake's edge. The fish seemed unimpressed with my bait, probably mocking me from beneath the surface. "Fine, I'll stick to canned beans," I laughed to myself as the sun dipped below the horizon. I settled by the campfire, enjoying the serenity. The stars began to peek out, more vivid than I'd ever seen. It was humbling, made me realize how small we are, just tiny specks in a vast universe. Or maybe that was the beans talking. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I secured the RV, double checking the locks, a habit from living in the city. Climbing into bed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Maybe I should quit my day job and become a professional camper, I mused before drifting off. A loud thud jolted me awake. Groggy, I glanced at my phone. 1:13 a.m. I listened intently. Another thud, followed by what sounded like metal scraping against metal. Probably just a raccoon, I told myself, though my pulse quickened. Curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing a flashlight, I peered out the window. In the dim glow, I saw a figure near the rear of the RV. Not a raccoon, unless they had started wearing jackets and standing upright. "Hey, who's there?" I shouted, hoping to sound more confident than I felt. The figure froze, then slowly turned toward me. The flashlight beam caught his face, a rugged man with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. His clothes were dirty and torn. He stared at me for a moment before breaking into a wide grin. "Evening, friend," he drawled. "Can I help you?" I asked, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Sorry to bother you," he said, taking a few steps closer. "My name's Roy. Truck broke down a mile back. Mind if I use your phone to call for help?" Something felt off. Maybe it was the odd hour, or the fact that there was no vehicle in sight. "I don't have a signal out here," I replied. "Closest ranger station is about 10 miles east." He chuckled softly. "No signal, huh? Mind if I come in and wait till morning?" Then I hesitated. "I'm sorry, but I'd prefer if you didn't. Nothing personal." His smile faded. "That's not very neighborly of you." "Look, I can't help you. Please leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right then. You have a good night." He turned and walked back into the darkness. I waited until I could no longer hear his footsteps before exhaling. "That was weird," I muttered. I decided it was best to move on. I started the engine, ready to find a new spot or maybe head to the ranger station myself. As I shifted into gear, the RV lurched but didn't move. I tried again. Nothing. Stepping outside to investigate, I found the rear tires slashed. My heart sank. This was no coincidence. A rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. I spun around, flashlight scanning the tree line. "Who's there?" Silence, then a low whistle pierced the quiet night. "Looking for me?" Roy stepped out, holding a hunting knife that glinted ominously. "What are you doing? What do you want?" I demanded, backing toward the RV door. He shrugged casually. "Company. It's a lonely night." I bolted inside and slammed the door, locking it. My mind raced. The tires were ruined and there was no cell signal. I needed a plan. A pounding on the door made me jump. "Open up, Felix," he called out. My blood ran cold. How did he know my name? Then I remembered the name tag on my backpack, visible through the window. "Go away," I shouted. He laughed. "We could have been friends, you know, but you had to be rude." I searched the RV for anything that could serve as a weapon. My eyes landed on a flare gun in the emergency kit. Not ideal, but better than nothing. The pounding grew more aggressive. The door hinges creaked under the strain. "Last chance," he warned. I took position at the far end of the RV, flare gun aimed at the door. With a final crash, the door gave way, and Roy stepped inside. "Leave me alone," I yelled. He took a step forward. "Or what?" Without hesitation, I fired the flare gun. The bright light shot across the space, striking him in the shoulder. He screamed as his shirt caught fire, stumbling backward out of the RV. Seizing the moment, I grabbed my keys and prayed the engine would cooperate. The RV groaned but moved slowly forward, riding on the rims. I steered onto the main road, the metal screeching against the asphalt. In the rearview mirror, I saw Roy extinguishing the flames, his face twisted in rage. He didn't give chase, but his eyes bore into me, a silent promise of vengeance. After a grueling hour, I spotted lights ahead, A small gas station, miraculously open. I pulled in. The attendant stared wide-eyed at the damaged RV. Call the police, I blurted out. There's a maniac out there who attacked me. He hurried inside to make the call. Minutes later, the place was swarming with officers. I recounted everything from the initial encounter to the attack. A search team was dispatched, and by dawn, they had Roy in custody. Turns out his real name was Martin Blake, a drifter with a long history of violent crimes. He'd been eluding authorities for months. An officer approached me as I sipped stale coffee inside the station. You're lucky, he said. We found evidence at his campsite suggesting he was planning something far worse. I didn't ask for details. Some things are better left unknown. They took my statement and offered medical assistance, but aside from a bruised ego, I was unharmed. The RV, on the other hand, would need some serious repairs. As the sun rose, I thanked the officers and arranged for a tow back to the city. So much for my peaceful getaway. Before leaving, the attendant handed me a fresh cup of coffee. On the house, he said with a sympathetic smile. Rough night? I chuckled. You could say that. Next time you want to get away, maybe I'll just visit a park in broad daylight. He laughed. Can't argue with that. Back in the city, life returned to its usual pace. The office gossip, the clacking of keyboards, the overpriced lattes. It all felt different now. Maybe I wasn't cut out for the wilderness, or maybe I just had exceptionally bad luck. One thing's for sure, I've got a hell of a story for the next office party, and perhaps an excuse to avoid camping invitations for the foreseeable future. They say nature is healing. I think I'll stick to therapy. My name is Jaden Ramirez, and back in 2015, I decided to take my newly acquired RV on a journey through the winding roads of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. After years behind a desk crunching numbers, I thought some fresh air and open spaces might do me good. Besides, how hard could camping be? It's like living at home, but with more trees and fewer takeout options. I stocked the RV, affectionately named Old Bessie, with all the essentials: canned beans, a questionable amount of beef jerky, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. My friends joked that I'd be back within a day, begging for Wi-Fi and a hot shower. I was determined to prove them wrong, or at least not get eaten by a bear. Spoiler alert, bears were the least of my worries. The first day was uneventful, which, in my book, was a win. I found a secluded spot by a clear stream, set up camp, and even managed to start a fire without singing my eyebrows off. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat outside sipping instant coffee, feeling like a rugged outdoorsman despite wearing socks with sandals. The next morning, I decided to explore a nearby trail. Armed with a map I could barely read and a compass I pretended to understand, I set off. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, birds chirping, leaves rustling, and my heavy breathing as I realized I was more out of shape than I thought. I stumbled upon a small waterfall and couldn't help but make a self-deprecating joke about finally finding the shower I needed. As I headed back, I noticed a rough-looking man chopping wood near a dilapidated cabin I'd somehow missed earlier. He was tall and lean, with a wild beard that suggested razors hadn't been invented yet. Howdy, I called out, trying to sound casual. He looked up, his eyes sharp. Didn't expect to see anyone around these parts. Yeah, just doing some camping, I replied. Name's Sam. He paused before responding. Walter? Nice to meet you. Didn't know anyone lived out here. He gave a curt nod. Been here a long time. An awkward silence followed. Well, I'll let you get back to it, I said, backing away slowly. Be careful out here, he said cryptically. Strangers can get lost. Thanks for the tip, I muttered, turning on my heel as I walked away. I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were still on me. That evening, I tried to brush off the encounter. Maybe he was just a hermit who wasn't used to company. I settled into the RV, locked the doors, because that's what you do in the middle of nowhere, and tried to read a book. Sleep came uneasily, with strange noises outside making me jump at every creak. Around midnight, I heard footsteps circling the RV. My heart pounded. I grabbed the closest thing resembling a weapon, a cast iron skillet, and held my breath. The footsteps stopped and a faint scratching sound began near the door. Summoning what little courage I had, I flung the door open, skillet raised. No one was there. Feeling foolish, I stepped outside. The night was eerily quiet, too quiet. I decided it was just a raccoon or maybe a particularly bold squirrel. As I turned to go back in, something caught my eye. A small carved wooden figurine placed on the step. It was shaped like a human skull. Very funny, I said aloud, hoping it was some prank by other campers. The next morning, I decided to find Walter. Maybe he knew if there were other people around. Plus, returning his creepy knickknack seemed like a good excuse. I headed toward the cabin, but found it deserted. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Windows shattered, the door hanging off its hinges, and nature was reclaiming the structure. A chill ran down my spine. Had I imagined him? No, we definitely spoke. As I examined the cabin, I noticed something disturbing. Photographs pinned to a wall inside, all of different people who looked like hikers or campers. Some were crossed out in red ink. I snapped a photo with my phone, handshaking. Time to leave, I thought. As I backed away, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around to see Walter emerging from the trees, a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. Leaving so soon, he asked, a sinister smile spreading across his face. I was just poking around. Where you shouldn't be, he interrupted. I glanced at the rifle. Look, I didn't mean any harm. He raised the gun slightly. City folks never do. Without another word, I bolted. Adrenaline surged as I sprinted toward my RV. Branches whipped my face, and rocks threatened to trip me with every step. I could hear him behind me, his boots pounding the earth. Can't run forever, he shouted. Challenge accepted, I thought grimly. I reached old Bessie and fumbled with the keys. My hands were slick with sweat. Finally, the door unlocked, and I dove inside. I jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. Not now, Bessie. Come on. I glanced out the window to see Walter emerging from the woods, raising his rifle. I ducked as a shot rang out, the bullet shattering the side mirror. Third time's the charm, I muttered, turning the key again. The engine roared to life. I slammed the RV into gear and stomped on the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, tires spitting gravel as I sped down the dirt road. Another shot hit the rear window, spider-webbing the glass. I gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white. The narrow road twisted and turned, and the RV groaned in protest. I didn't care if I blew a tire or wrecked the suspension. I needed to get as far away as possible. After what felt like hours, I spotted a ranger station ahead. Relief washed over me. I pulled in recklessly, nearly hitting a parked Jeep. I stumbled out, shouting incoherently. A park ranger rushed out to meet me. Sir, are you okay? There's a man. He's trying to kill me, I gasped. The ranger guided me inside. Calm down and tell me what happened. As I recounted the events, two more rangers joined us. They exchanged grim looks. You're not the first to report something like this, one said. Who is he? I demanded. Name's Walter Griggs, the first ranger replied. Used to be a hunter until he lost his family in a fire. Been living off the grid ever since. Folks say he's not right in the head. That's putting it mildly, I retorted. We'll send a team out to find him, the ranger assured me. In the meantime, you should stay here. I nodded, exhaustion hitting me like a freight train. They offered me a cot in the back room. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but make a dark joke to myself. Next time I want solitude, I'll just lock myself in the office supply closet. The Rangers weren't able to locate Walter that night. The following morning, they escorted me back to my RV. The damage was worse than I thought. Tires slashed, windows broken, and the words "No Escape" carved into the driver's side door. "Looks like I'm not driving out of here," I said. "We can arrange for a tow," the ranger offered. "Appreciate it." While we waited, I asked if they had any more information on Walter. "Legend has it he blames outsiders for what happened to his family," the ranger explained. "Thinks the government or tourists had something to do with it. He's been a ghost in these woods for years." "Great," I said. I had to run into the one-man welcoming committee. The tow truck arrived, and soon old Bessie and I were on our way back to civilization. As we pulled onto the main road, I took one last look at the dense forest. Part of me half expected to see Walter standing at the tree line, rifle in hand, but there was nothing, just the sway of the trees in the wind. Back in town, I filed a report with the local authorities. They assured me they'd keep an eye out, but admitted that finding him in that vast wilderness was like finding a needle in a haystack. "Fantastic," I sighed. "At least needles don't usually shoot at you." With my RV in the shop and my nerves shot, I checked into a motel. The receptionist gave me a curious look as I walked in, probably due to my disheveled appearance and the lingering smell of fear. "Rough day?" she asked. "You could say that," I replied. "Got any rooms where the only thing I have to worry about is bad room service?" She smiled sympathetically. "I'll see what I can do." That night, I ordered an overpriced burger and flipped through channels aimlessly. A news report caught my attention. Local authorities are investigating reports of a man threatening campers in the Great Smoky Mountains. "No kidding," I muttered. The next morning, I got a call from the ranger station. They'd found more evidence at Walter's cabin: personal belongings from missing hikers and a makeshift journal detailing his plans to cleanse the woods of intruders. "He's a real piece of work," I said. "We advise you to stay away from the area until we apprehend him," the ranger cautioned. "Don't have to tell me twice." With my RV still under repair, I decided it was time to head home. Maybe the concrete jungle wasn't so bad after all. At least the only predators there were aggressive taxi drivers and the occasional pigeon with a grudge. As I boarded the bus out of town, I couldn't resist making one last joke to the driver. "Any chance this thing is bulletproof?" He gave me a puzzled look. No." "Figures," I said, taking a seat. The bus pulled away, and I watched as the mountains faded into the distance. I thought about Walter Griggs, a man consumed by his own madness, turning his pain into violence against strangers. His motivations were his own, twisted and dark, but that was behind me now. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and decided that my next vacation would be somewhere safer, like a nice, quiet beach. My name is Nolan Whitaker, and back in 2016, I took my old RV on a much-needed trip to Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. I'd always been more comfortable with a laptop than a map, so my friends joked that I'd get lost the moment I left the driveway. Maybe they were onto something. I was a software engineer who had spent too many late nights debugging code and not enough time enjoying the great outdoors. I figured it was time to trade the glow of a monitor for some real sunshine. Plus, I thought the change might help me come up with the next big app idea. You know, a guy goes into the woods and comes out a millionaire. Well, at least that was the plan. The drive to Wyoming was uneventful, filled with podcasts and my off-key singing. Upon reaching the park, the towering peaks of the Tetons greeted me like old friends I hadn't met yet. I found a cozy spot at an RV campground near Jenny Lake, surrounded by pine trees and the distant sound of water. As I set up camp, a neighboring RV pulled in. Out stepped a middle-aged couple, Mark and Linda Thompson. They were retirees traveling the country, ticking national parks off their bucket list. Mark had a knack for dad jokes. "Why did the camper bring a ladder to the campground?" he asked. "Why?" I played along. "Because the stakes were too high." We shared a laugh, and they invited me over for dinner. It was nice to have company, and Linda's cooking beat my canned beans any day. The next morning, I decided to hike one of the easier trails. I'm no mountaineer, and my fitness level is best described as computer chair potato. I packed a small bag, filled my water bottle, and set off. About an hour into the hike, I came across a man carving something into a tree. He was tall and gaunt, with unkempt hair that looked like it hadn't met a comb in years. His clothes were worn, stained with dirt, and who knows what else. "Morning," I offered. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me regret opening my mouth. "Beautiful day," he muttered before turning back to his carving. I glanced at the tree. He had etched a series of symbols, circles intersected by jagged lines. It didn't look like the usual hearts and initials people scratch into bark. "Interesting artwork," I said, trying to sound casual. He paused, the knife still pressed against the wood. "Just marking the way," he replied. "Ah, well, have a good one," I said, deciding it was time to keep moving. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach. Maybe it was just the altitude. That evening, back at the campground, I mentioned the encounter to Mark and Linda. "Probably just a local eccentric," Mark said. "Every place has one, adds character." "Yeah, maybe," I agreed, but Linda seemed concerned. "Be careful out there," she warned. "Not everyone you meet in the woods has good intentions." "Noted," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "I'll make sure to bring my superhero cape next time." The next day, I decided to stay around the campground, maybe do some reading, and finally start that novel I'd been putting off. Around midday, a park ranger named Emily Jacobs stopped by. She was doing her rounds, friendly and full of information about the area's wildlife. "Seen anything interesting?" she asked. "Besides a squirrel stealing my trail mix, not much," I joked. "Well, keep an eye out. We've had reports of some vandalism on the trails, strange symbols carved into trees. Actually, I think I saw some yesterday," I said, recounting my encounter. Her expression grew serious. "Did you get a good look at the person doing it?" "Yeah, tall guy, kind of scruffy, seemed off." "Thanks for letting me know," she said. "We'll keep an eye out." The rest of the day was uneventful until evening rolled around. As I was grilling some burgers, Mark approached me. "Have you seen Linda?" "Not since this morning," I replied. "She went for a walk a few hours ago and hasn't come back." "Maybe she found a good spot to paint," I suggested. Linda was an amateur artist, always sketching. "Yeah, maybe," he said, but his eyes betrayed his worry. "Tell you what, I'll help you look." We set off with flashlights, calling her name as dusk settled in. The forest seemed to swallow our voices. After an hour of searching, we decided to inform Ranger Jacobs. She organized a small search party, and we continued our efforts. Around midnight, one of the volunteers shouted, "Over here!" We rushed to find them standing near a clearing. On the ground lay Linda's scarf, stained red. Nearby, the same cryptic symbols were carved into several trees, deeper and more aggressive this time. Mark's face went pale. "What the hell is going on?" Ranger Jacobs tried to keep everyone calm. "Let's head back. We'll expand the search at first light." Back at the campground, an uneasy silence settled over us. Mark retreated into his RV, and I could hear muffled sobs through the thin walls. Unable to sleep, I sat outside, poking at the dying embers of the fire. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw the man from the trail standing at the edge of my campsite. "You should leave," he whispered. "Excuse me?" "Bad things happen here. Best to move on." "Did you have something to do with Linda's disappearance?" I asked, standing up. He tilted his head, a slow grin spreading across his face. "She's with the forest now." I felt a surge of anger and fear. "Where is she?" He took a step back. "Warnings were given," he said before disappearing into the darkness. Heart pounding, I ran to Ranger Jacobs Station. Bursting in, I found her poring over maps. "I just saw him. The guy carving symbols. He was at my camp." She grabbed her radio. "Stay here." Within minutes, a few rangers assembled, and they headed out to search. I stayed behind, feeling both helpless and frustrated. Hours passed with no word. Just as dawn broke, the Rangers returned, their faces grim. "We found something," Emily said. She led me and Mark to another clearing, deeper in the woods. There we saw a shallow grave, freshly dug. Inside were remains, clothes matching what Linda had been wearing, and bones scattered haphazardly. Mark fell to his knees, a guttural cry escaping his lips. I placed a hand on his shoulder, words failing me. "We need to get you both back," Emily said softly. "It's not safe here." As we made our way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees seemed to close in, the canopy blocking out the morning light. Back at the campground, law enforcement had arrived. They questioned us separately. I recounted everything: the symbols, the man, his warnings. An officer named Detective Harris took particular interest. "We've been tracking someone matching that description," he said. "Goes by the name of Silas Reed, former forestry worker who went off the grid after some incidents." "What kind of incidents?" "Several hikers went missing over the past few years. Never enough evidence to pin anything on him, but he's our prime suspect." "Well, he's here, and he's dangerous." "Don't worry," Harris assured me. "We'll find him." They organized a manhunt, officers and rangers combing the forest. Mark was taken to a local hospital. He was in shock. I was advised to leave the area, but something kept me there. Maybe it was guilt, or perhaps a misguided sense of responsibility. Either way, I decided to stay one more night in the RV before heading home. That evening, as the campground emptied, I felt more isolated than ever. The silence was oppressive. I locked all the doors and windows, double checking everything. Around midnight, a loud thud jolted me awake. My heart raced as I listened intently. Another thud, this time closer. Grabbing a kitchen knife, not the most heroic weapon, but better than nothing, I crept toward the front of the RV, peering through the window. I saw nothing but darkness. Then a whisper cut through the silence. "You should have heeded the warnings." I spun around, and there he was, inside the RV. Silas stood, blocking the exit. His eyes were wild and unhinged. "How did you get in here?" I stammered. "Doors only keep out those who respect barriers," he said, stepping closer. "Look, I don't want any trouble." "Trouble found you," he sneered. In a panic, I lunged forward, trying to push past him. He was stronger than he looked, grabbing me by the arm and throwing me against the wall. The knife slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. He picked it up, inspecting it like a curious child. "Not much of a weapon," he mused. Desperate, I looked for anything to use. My eyes landed on a canister of bear spray on the counter. With a quick movement, I grabbed it and aimed. The spray hit him square in the face. He screamed, dropping the knife and clutching his eyes. Seizing the opportunity, I darted past him and out of the RV. I ran blindly into the woods, branches slapping against my face. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps and ragged breathing. "You're only making it worse," he shouted. My lungs burned, but adrenaline kept me moving. Ahead, I spotted a faint light, a ranger station. Pushing myself harder, I burst into the clearing, banging on the door. "Help!" I yelled. The door opened, and Emily pulled me inside. "What's going on?" "Silas! He's after me!" She locked the door and radioed for backup. "Stay here." We could hear him outside, circling the station. "No use hiding," he taunted. "Is there another way out?" I whispered. She shook her head. "But help is on the way." The window shattered as rocks came flying through. Silas reached in, trying to unlock the door. Emily drew her service weapon. "Stop or I'll shoot," he laughed. "Bullets won't stop what's meant to be." She fired a warning shot, the sound deafening in the small space. He recoiled but didn't retreat. "Backup is minutes away," she said. "We just need to hold out." He began pounding on the walls, the whole structure shaking. I looked around for anything to barricade the door. "Help me with this," I said, pointing to a heavy cabinet. We shoved it against the door just as Silas threw his weight against it. The wood creaked but held firm. Sirens echoed in the distance. Silas seemed to notice, his attacks becoming more frantic. "You brought this on yourself," he yelled. Headlights swept over the clearing as police vehicles arrived. Officers poured out, weapons drawn. "Silas Reed, stand down!" Detective Harris commanded. Silas backed away from the station, eyes darting between the officers. For a moment, I thought he might surrender. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a rusted hatchet. "They won't stop me," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "Last warning," Harris shouted. Silas charged. Multiple shots rang out, and he fell to the ground. Silence settled over the scene, broken only by the crackle of police radios. They approached him cautiously, checking for a pulse. "He's alive," an officer announced. "Get a medic." Relief washed over me, my legs giving out as I sank to the floor. Emily placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over." In the aftermath, authorities searched Silas's makeshift cabin, hidden deep within the forest. They found personal belongings from several missing hikers, including Linda's journals. They detailed his descent into madness, convinced that the forest demanded sacrifices to preserve its sanctity. Detective Harris later informed me that Silas had been a promising environmentalist before a personal tragedy unhinged him. His wife had died in a hiking accident years prior, and he blamed the influx of tourists for disrupting the natural order. Silas Reed was charged with multiple counts, including murder and kidnapping. With the evidence collected, there was no doubt he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars. As for me, I packed up my RV, ready to return to the familiar glow of computer screens and the hum of city life. Nature, it seemed, was more unpredictable than any line of code I'd ever encountered. My name's Gabriel Shaw, and in 2014, I took my RV to a spot near Kenai Fjords National Park in Alaska. I'm not a survivalist or a wilderness guide. I'm an accountant from Atlanta who got fed up with numbers and paperwork, so I figured I'd finally hit pause on life and spend a couple of weeks camping. I drove all the way from Georgia, chasing the quiet, thinking Alaska would be the kind of place where I could just sit back with a beer and let my brain go blank for a while. When I parked the RV in this isolated area just outside the national park, it felt perfect. Not a single person around. I was miles from the nearest campground, let alone a neighbor, and to me, that was ideal. I was setting up my little oasis when I noticed a couple of things off the bat that didn't sit right. The first was the absence of wildlife. I mean, it's Alaska. Bears, moose, the whole lot. But around me, nothing. No scat on the ground, no broken branches from animals passing by, just silence, except for the faint rustling of leaves. By day 3, I'd settled into a good routine. Coffee in the morning, a short hike in the woods, then I'd grill up whatever canned meal I felt like eating. It was on one of these afternoon hikes that I stumbled across an old, half-collapsed wooden cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The door was hanging off the hinges, and there was this strange smell around it, a mix of rotting wood and something sharper, kind of metallic. I figured it was rust from some old tool or metal scrap inside, so I brushed it off. But something didn't sit right with me. There were bits of clothing scattered around the area, shirts, old jackets, even a pair of jeans. It looked like they'd been there for years, frayed and faded by the weather. I don't know why, but I felt a chill. Part of me thought I should turn back, but another part, maybe the accountant side that just needs answers, thought I should go inside and take a look around. The interior was even worse. Dirt was caked on every surface. The floor was covered in what looked like animal bones, small ones, maybe birds or rabbits. And there was that same metallic smell, stronger now. I looked up and noticed something hanging from the ceiling. It was a hook, the kind you'd see in butcher shops. It didn't belong there, not in the middle of a forest, but it was there all the same, swaying slightly as if disturbed by some breeze that I couldn't feel. At that point, I decided to head back to the RV. I figured it was best to keep my distance from whatever strange things were left behind in that place. But when I stepped out of the cabin, I could have sworn I heard footsteps, faint and dragging behind me. I stopped, turned around, and waited, but nothing appeared. The forest around me was dead silent again. Back at the RV, I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I just psyched myself out. That night, though, I barely slept. I'd brought a shotgun with me just in case of wildlife, and I kept it by my side. Every little noise outside felt amplified, like something was creeping around just out of sight. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Morning came, and I felt a bit stupid. I decided to spend the day fishing in a small creek I'd passed earlier, trying to distract myself. But even out by the water, that eerie silence remained. No birds chirping, no fish biting, just the occasional snap of a twig somewhere behind me, which I tried my best to ignore. The thought that maybe I wasn't alone out here crept up more than once, and I started questioning if maybe I'd made a mistake coming out this far. Then, later that evening, as I was grilling up some fish, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, just on the edge of the tree line. I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing, but all I could make out was a figure, a man, maybe, crouching low, watching me. He was dressed in what looked like layers upon layers of dirt clothes, all torn up and mud streaked, his face partially obscured by a tangle of hair. He was still as a statue, just watching. I shouted out to him, trying to play it cool, asking if he was lost, but he didn't respond. Instead, he slowly ducked back into the trees, disappearing without a sound. Every instinct told me I needed to pack up and leave, but stubborn as I was, I convinced myself that he was probably just some harmless drifter. I thought if I ignored him, he'd go away. The next night, things escalated. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a scraping noise coming from outside. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something was being pulled along the side of the RV. I froze, gripping the shotgun tighter than ever, listening. The scraping moved along the length of the vehicle, stopping right outside the window next to my bed. I didn't dare look out. For a solid hour, I just lay there, sweating, listening to the faint scratching on the metal, then silence. I finally drifted off, hoping I'd imagined the whole thing. But in the morning, when I stepped outside, there were muddy handprints smeared along the side of the RV. That was enough for me. I started packing up my stuff, thinking I'd head back to the main road and find a new spot, maybe closer to a town. But as I loaded the last of my things, I spotted him again, standing a few yards away by a cluster of birch trees, staring at me with this blank, almost curious expression. He was holding a long, rusty blade, one that looked like it had seen far too much use, and his clothes were even filthier than before. I didn't think. I raised the shotgun and aimed at him, shouting for him to stay back. He just smiled, a slow, unsettling grin, and started to walk toward me, dragging that blade along the ground. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping he'd take the hint, but he kept coming, unfazed, picking up speed. At that moment, I knew I couldn't just wait around. I ran back into the RV, locked the door, and fired up the engine. But the man lunged at the driver's side window, slamming his fist against it, that rusty blade scraping along the glass. I stomped on the gas, swerving as he clung to the side, banging on the window, his face pressed against it with that same terrifying smile. The RV lurched forward, finally throwing him off balance, and I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. After what felt like an eternity, I hit the highway, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away, where I could finally breathe. The police in Anchorage were polite but skeptical. They took down my statement and checked out the muddy handprints on the RV, but all they could offer was a half-hearted promise to patrol the area. They didn't even sound like they believed me. Later, out of curiosity, or maybe just out of fear, I did some digging. I found a couple of stories about a man named Gideon who was known to lurk in those woods. Rumored to be some kind of deranged hermit who'd lived there for decades, people said he'd lost his family in a hunting accident and went off the deep end, becoming obsessed with cleansing the forest of outsiders. My name is Jackson Lopez, and I'm 29 years old. This happened last fall, and while I've tried to convince myself it wasn't real, the scars, mental and physical, remind me otherwise. I was working as a freelance journalist at the time, tasked with writing a piece about haunted locations in New England. I'd always been skeptical about ghost stories, chalking them up to overactive imaginations or clever hoaxes. But after that weekend in the Freetown Fall River State Forest, I no longer have the luxury of disbelief. It started as a simple camping trip. My boyfriend, Lucas, had suggested we go together. He was 30, adventurous, and constantly looking for the next thrill. Jared, my colleague and the third member of our group, tagged along with his paranormal investigation gear. At 31, Jared was a tech enthusiast and part-time blogger with a fascination for the supernatural. The plan was simple: camp near the caves, a section of the forest infamous for strange disappearances and satanic rituals, and see if we could gather enough material for a solid story. We arrived on a chilly Friday afternoon. The forest felt dense, its canopy blotting out most of the light. I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine as we set up camp, but something about the place felt wrong. The air was heavy, and even Lucas, who normally brushed off my concerns, admitted it felt weirdly quiet. After setting up the tent, Jared unpacked his equipment: infrared cameras, audio recorders, and even an electromagnetic field detector. He was like a kid in a candy store, buzzing over each device. Meanwhile, Lucas built a fire, cracking jokes to lighten the mood. I forced a smile and focused on jotting notes in my journal. As night fell, the forest came alive with unfamiliar sounds: branches snapping in the distance, the occasional rustle of leaves. Jared insisted it was just wildlife, but my nerves were frayed. Then we heard it: faint laughter. It was soft at first, high-pitched and childlike, drifting through the trees. I froze, looking at Lucas, who frowned and turned his head to listen. Jared grabbed his recorder, his eyes alight with excitement. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, as if afraid to scare it off. "Yes," I said, my voice tight. It sounded like a kid. "It's probably other campers," Lucas said, though he didn't sound convinced. He poked at the fire, making sparks fly, but the laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, more persistent, until it seemed to echo from every direction. Jared checked the recorder but found nothing, just static. That's when I noticed the shadows at the edge of the firelight. Figures darted between the trees just out of focus. My breath hitched. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing. Lucas shook his head. "It's just your imagination," he said. "No," Jared said, his voice trembling. "She's right. There's something there." The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving us in an oppressive silence. My skin prickled, as if the forest itself were watching. The next morning, I volunteered to collect firewood, hoping a bit of distance would clear my head. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I came across a gruesome sight: a mutilated deer carcass. Its body was split open, and strange symbols were carved into its flesh. Flies buzzed around the open wounds. My stomach churned, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. I ran back to camp, breathless, and told Lucas and Jared what I'd found. "Probably coyotes," Lucas said, though his tone lacked conviction. "No," I snapped. "Coyotes don't carve symbols into their prey." Jared's face paled. "Symbols? What kind of symbols?" I sketched them in the dirt, and Jared muttered something about occult rituals. Lucas dismissed it as nonsense, but the tension between them was palpable. That evening, the shadows returned. This time, they were bolder, flickering just beyond the firelight. Lucas tried to brush it off, but even he was on edge. Jared set up his camera and stared at the screen, his hands trembling. Then came the voices. They were soft at first, barely more than whispers, but unmistakably ours. I heard my own voice calling from the woods. Lucas! Jared, help! Jared heard his own voice too, and Lucas's name echoed from deeper in the forest. The mimicry was perfect, too perfect. Lucas jumped to his feet, grabbing a flashlight. Don't go out there, I shouted, grabbing his arm. He shook me off. It's probably a prank. Someone's messing with us. Before I could stop him, he ventured into the darkness. Jared and I huddled by the fire, listening to the crunch of his footsteps fade. Then came the scream. Lucas ran back, pale and gasping for breath. There's something out there, he stammered. Something big. It's not human. The next morning, we decided to investigate the caves, hoping to find answers or at least an explanation. As we approached, the air grew colder and the forest seemed to darken. The entrance to the caves was narrow and jagged, almost like a gaping mouth. Inside, the walls were covered in strange carvings, similar to the symbols I'd seen on the deer. At the center of the chamber, we found a crude shrine made of animal bones and a tattered child's dress stained with what looked like blood. Jared turned on his camera, but it flickered and died. What the hell? He muttered, shaking it. It was fully charged. That's when the laughter returned, louder than ever, reverberating off the cave walls. Shadows danced along the edges of the chamber, forming a tall humanoid figure with glowing eyes. It stepped forward, its grin impossibly wide. Welcome, it said in a voice that mimicked Jared's perfectly. You've come to play. The figure moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking like a puppet on strings. It circled us, its grin never wavering. You trespass on cursed land, it said, its voice shifting between all three of ours. The price must be paid. Lucas grabbed a branch from the fire we built outside the cave, holding it like a weapon. Stay back, he shouted, though his voice shook. The entity laughed, a horrible guttural sound that made my skin crawl. Fire won't save you, it said, stepping closer. Without warning, it lunged at Jared, dragging him into the darkness. His screams echoed, then cut off abruptly. Lucas and I ran, stumbling over rocks and roots as the forest seemed to close in around us. No matter which direction we ran, we always ended up back at the campsite. It was as if the forest itself was alive, trapping us in a nightmarish loop. Lucas grew frantic, lashing out at the trees and shouting curses. I tried to calm him, but I was barely holding it together myself. That night, the entity returned, standing just outside the circle of firelight. It watched us with those glowing eyes, grinning as if savoring our fear. You can't escape, it said in my voice. The forest always takes what it's owed. Desperate, I remembered something I'd read about salt being a protective barrier against spirits. I grabbed a container from my pack and poured a circle around myself. The entity snarled, pacing just outside the line. Lucas wasn't so lucky. As he tried to fend it off with a burning branch, it swiped at him, slashing his chest open. He collapsed, gasping for breath, as blood pooled beneath him. Run, he choked, his voice barely a whisper. Get out of here. I wanted to help him, but the entity was closing in. I stayed in the circle, trembling as the night dragged on. When dawn finally broke, the forest returned to its normal state. The entity vanished, leaving no trace of Lucas or Jared. I stumbled out of the forest, disoriented and covered in dirt. No one believed my story. Of course, the authorities chalked it up to a tragic accident, wild animals, or exposure. But I know the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that laughter again, faint and distant, and I wonder if the forest will ever truly let me go. My name is Lillian Reynolds, and I'm 30 years old. This happened last October during what was supposed to be a routine work trip. I'm a freelance travel writer, and I'd been assigned a feature on overlooked hiking destinations in New England. It sounded perfect at first, a chance to write, explore, and test my limits. But I left Mount Greylock with more than I'd bargained for. What I experienced there wasn't just unsettling. It was something I still can't fully explain. I arrived at the base of Mount Greylock late in the afternoon, driving my trusty RV into a small, secluded campsite. The air was crisp, and the trees glowed in shades of gold and red. It should have been idyllic, but something about the silence felt unnatural. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just the hum of my RV's engine. As I parked, there were a few other campsites nearby, but only one seemed occupied. An old green tent sat pitched a little ways down, but I didn't see anyone around. Probably out hiking, I thought, dismissing the odd emptiness. After setting up, I cooked a quick meal, wrote some notes about the day's drive, and crawled into bed. As I drifted off, I thought I heard footsteps outside the RV, soft, deliberate. I told myself it was just another camper returning late. The next morning, I prepped for a hike up one of Greylock's lesser known trails. I'd planned to take photos for my article and get some inspiration for my writing. As I locked up the RV, I glanced at the green tent again. It looked untouched, and there was still no sign of its occupants. The trail started easy enough, winding through towering maples and oaks. I felt myself relax as the sun filtered through the leaves. But about halfway up, the path became overgrown and harder to follow. My map didn't match the terrain anymore, and my GPS couldn't get a signal. Then I saw them for the first time, tall, shadowy figures just beyond the tree line. I froze, heart pounding. They weren't solid, more like dense patches of darkness that wavered in the sunlight. I blinked, and they were gone. Just shadows, I told myself. Tree trunks, maybe? Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I pushed on, snapping a few photos, but my enthusiasm for the hike had dimmed. By the time I made it back to camp, the light was fading, and I was exhausted. As I approached the RV, I noticed something unsettling. The door was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it before I left. That night, the RV's battery died. I couldn't cook, charge my phone, or power the heater. Frustrated, I ate a cold granola bar by flashlight and scribbled notes about the hike. My writing felt forced, and I couldn't shake the unease from earlier. When I finally crawled into bed, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like the rustle of leaves. Then they grew louder, words forming in a language I didn't recognize. My skin prickled as I strained to listen. Sarah, my name, spoken in a voice that sounded eerily like my father's. Come out, Mia. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering. My father had passed away years ago. I threw on a jacket and stepped outside, shining my flashlight into the dark. The beam caught movement, a tall, humanoid shape standing at the edge of the campsite. They didn't move, just stood there, their hollow faces turned toward me. I stumbled backward into the RV and slammed the door shut, locking it tight. The next morning, I decided to investigate the green tent. Something about its abandonment gnawed at me. Inside, I found a few belongings: a half-empty water bottle, a jacket, and a leather-bound journal. The journal's last entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. They're watching us. The hollow ones, tall, shadow-faced things that look human but aren't. They follow you, whisper your name. Don't go into the woods at night. Don't listen to the whispers. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Whoever had written this wasn't coming back. By now, I was desperate to leave. I packed up my gear, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I turned the key again and again now, but it wouldn't budge. That night, the hollow ones came closer, their faces, if you could call them that, pressed against the RV's windows, featureless and black. I huddled in the corner with a knife in hand, though I knew it wouldn't do any good. They didn't break in, but their whispers filled the air, louder and more insistent. They called my name, taunting me with memories of my family, my failures, my fears. The next morning, I found a bundle of sage in the abandoned tent. I didn't know if it would work, but I was willing to try anything. That night, as the hollow ones surrounded the RV, I lit the sage and waved it around, chanting every prayer I could remember. For the first time, they seemed to hesitate. their shadows flickering as though caught in a strong wind. But they didn't leave. I realized they weren't just spirits, they were the mountain itself, its ancient malevolent essence given form. At dawn, I tried the RV's engine one last time. It roared to life. I didn't question it. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The hollow ones stood at the edge of the forest, their hollow faces watching me. I never wrote the article. Some stories are better left untold. My name is Anthony Williams, and I'm 38 years old. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts or witches. I teach history, for God's sake. I deal in facts, dates, and evidence. But something happened last fall in Freetown, Fall River State Forest that I can't explain. Something that's haunted me ever since. I had just finalized my divorce after nearly a decade of marriage. To say I was lost would be an understatement. My once stable life had crumbled, and I was left with questions I couldn't answer. A friend suggested I take some time for myself, and I figured a weekend camping trip might clear my head. Freetown Woods seemed like the perfect spot, a place steeped in history and folklore. I thought I'd hike, journal a bit, and maybe find some clarity. I loaded up my RV and drove out to one of the more remote campsites on the edge of the forest. The place was almost eerily quiet, with no other campers in sight. I parked, set up camp, and sat back to enjoy the peace. If I'd known what was coming, I never would have stepped foot in those woods. I spent the first day exploring the trails near my campsite. The air was crisp, and the leaves were fiery shades of red and orange. It was beautiful, exactly what I needed. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon a clearing that felt wrong. The air was colder here, and the trees seemed older, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. In the center of the clearing was a circle of blackened stones surrounded by trees marked with strange carvings. I knelt to examine the stones. They looked burned, as if someone had built a fire here, but the scorch marks didn't fade with the weathering I'd expect. The carvings on the trees were even stranger, symbols I didn't recognize, like crude spirals and jagged lines. Probably some kids messing around, I muttered, brushing it off. That night, as I sat by my RV's small fire pit, I couldn't stop thinking about the circle. Something about it gnawed at me, but I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. As I lay in bed, I heard footsteps outside. They weren't heavy like a person's, more like something creeping, testing the ground. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window. Nothing, just shadows and trees. The next morning, I decided to hike back to the circle. I'm not sure why. Curiosity, I guess. When I got there, something was different. The carvings on the trees now included my initials, AW. I froze. My rational mind fought to make sense of it. Maybe someone saw me yesterday and decided to mess with me, but how could they carve it so cleanly, so quickly? And why would they bother? The trail back to camp seemed longer than I remembered. The woods felt darker, and the silence pressed in on me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I was being followed, but every time I turned, the path was empty. When I finally reached my RV, the sun was already low. I made dinner and tried to distract myself by reading, but the unease clung to me. That night, I dreamed of fire. I was bound to a stake in the middle of the circle, flames licking at my feet as shadowy figures chanted in a language I didn't recognize. I woke drenched in sweat, and when I looked down, my arms and legs were streaked with ash and soot. I wanted to leave. I packed up my gear and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I cursed, checked the battery, the oil, everything I could think of, but nothing worked. I decided to wait until morning to call for help. There was no cell service out here, of course. I tried to distract myself with a book, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the oppressive silence returned. That's when I saw her. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. Her clothes were tattered and her face was obscured by shadow. Hello? I called out, stepping closer. She didn't move. Are you lost? Still nothing. As I took another step, she vanished. The next night, the temperature plummeted. I huddled inside the RV, wrapped in every blanket I had. Around midnight, I heard the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the rustle of leaves. Then they grew louder, circling the RV, speaking words I couldn't understand. I peeked out the window and saw them, figures with hollow, glowing eyes standing motionless in the clearing. In the center of them stood the woman. This time, her face was visible, pale, with sunken eyes and a cruel smile. She raised a hand and pointed at me. You don't belong here, she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. I tried to drive away, but the RV still wouldn't start. Panicking, I grabbed a flashlight and ran for the main trail, hoping to find help. The woods twisted around me, the path shifting and folding back on itself. Every time I thought I'd made progress, I ended up back at the witch's circle. She was waiting for me there. Stay, she whispered. You've lost everything. Let me give you peace. Her words burrowed into my mind, echoing my own doubts and fears. I wanted to give in, to let the darkness swallow me, but something inside me fought back. I remembered the leather journal I'd found earlier that day in a hollow log near the circle. It had belonged to another camper, someone who'd written about their own encounter with the witch. They'd mentioned burning something sacred to her to break her hold. I scanned the circle and spotted a piece of cloth tied to one of the trees. It looked old, like it had been there for centuries. Grabbing it, I threw it into the center of the stones and lit it with my lighter. The flames roared to life, and the witch screamed, a bone-chilling sound that echoed through the woods. The figures vanished, and the forest grew silent once more. At dawn, I returned to the RV and tried the engine one last time. It roared to life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The witch stood at the edge of the clearing, her hollow eyes watching me. I haven't been back to Freetown Woods since, and I never will.